The Toronto Maple Leafs have a massive decision to make, and as free agency is now underway, and the Toronto Maple Leafs are potentially looking to trade Mitch Marner and to make many other moves in free agency to strengthen their lineup, Connor Dewar has made a decision that could really affect the Toronto Maple Leafs this offseason. It could have some major repercussions going forward. So I'm going to break all that down in this episode. But before we do, if you're a part of the percentage who aren't subscribed to the channel, hit that button. We're producing daily Leafs content. Now, Darius, we have a lot to go over today, and specifically focusing on Connor Dewar and the impact that his decision could make on the Toronto Maple Leafs going forward. And this was one that not many Leafs fans expected him to make, quite frankly. And let's just dive into it. Let's not waste any more time. So breaking, Connor Dewar has filed for arbitration. His hearing will fall between July 20th and August 4th. Now, Darius, before we get into a bunch of the other stuff, I just want to get your initial thoughts on this. I find this extremely interesting that he filed for arbitration. Some Leafs fans are upset, saying that his production doesn't equate him doing this. I want to hear your thoughts on this. This is obviously after the Leafs extended their qualifying offer to him.
Yeah, some fans are saying, like you said, that his production doesn't equate to the cap hit and what we're going to get into, what he may make. But honestly, I'm not surprised by this a lot at all. A lot of players do this. There's a lot of notable players around the league this year that did this as well, right? A lot of notable defensemen, even from the New York Rangers, for example. So I'm not surprised by this specifically, but the number, which we'll get into, is a little surprising. And I think the Leafs coming up here really soon are going to have to make a decision that could affect pretty much the rest of the lineup because they're right up against the cap.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is that this decision, obviously Connor Dewar in itself is not a huge, he's a good player, but he's not a crazy superstar, and his decisions aren't going to make a ton of immediate impact on the Maple Leafs. But the issue is that, which we'll dive into now, you can see this, Leafs Connor Dewar files for salary arbitration, and the analytics project a 2-year deal with an AAV of about 1.5 million, which is hefty. This was obviously a guy who was acquired at the trade deadline last year and honestly was very good last season for the Toronto Maple Leafs, doing what he does in the PK and things like that. But you can see this again, 1.5 million, 2 years, which is a 78% raise over his salary last season. And the Leafs only had one other player eligible for arbitration going into the season, which was Timothy Liljegren. And obviously we know what happened with him. He also got a hefty raise, which was a bit of a debatable contract among Leafs fans and Leafs Nation out there. What are your, that's the thing, this could have a huge impact. And you see some Leafs fans, and this is kind of the sentiment right now, what does Connor Dewar do to be paid nearly $1.5 million AAV? And you may ask that question. Only 19 points, 74 games, 10 minutes or 11 minutes average time on ice to be paying $1.5 million. I don't know if the Leafs should do this, considering the fact that they already gave Timothy Liljegren, they're giving Timothy Liljegren, obviously different players, different positions, $3 million AAV per year, which is a bit absurd in itself anyway. I don't know if you can go ahead and get $4.5 million a year combined to Dewar and Timothy Liljegren.
Things are starting to snowball, right? Like, I like how you brought up the Liljegren thing. The contract's a little bit shocking, and it's starting to take up a lot of cap space. And when you look at the Leafs' fourth line, the projected fourth line heading into next season, it almost makes $5 million, right? So when you look at the $1.5 million thing, you're like, okay, it's not that much compared to other teams. But in the Leafs' current cap structure, it makes almost no sense. Like, this is another fourth liner. And yes, he was good on the penalty kill. And I think Brad Treliving said at his exit interview at the end of the season said, he wants to bring the player back. He was talking about Connor Dewar as if he was still on the team, right? He was going to be back and returning. So I think they really like the player, but they're going to have to make a decision coming up here. I'm not saying to trade him or get rid of him specifically, but something else in the lineup, whether it's trade David Kampf, which we talked about recently, even Ryan Reeves trying to get out from under this. The one other thing that nobody's really talking about is, I believe because he filed for arbitration, this opens the Leafs up to a second buyout window. So I wonder if they end up using that just to save a little bit of cap on somebody, right? I don't think they'll end up doing that, but it's an option, right? So I haven't really seen too many people talking about that, but I'm pretty sure it opens up a second buyout window for them that they can use if things kind of turn on its head, right? Because their cap situation right now, very interesting heading into next season. But like I said, I don't think he's a bad player. He could make 1.5 somewhere else, but when you have almost $5 million wrapped up in your fourth line here, I'm not sure that's a secret for success.
Yeah, it's not a recipe for success at all. And you look at it,
That's it.
salary arbitration. You mentioned it here, and this is what we can kind of dive into now. So should the Leafs get to the same point with Dewar and is awarded a settlement, it opens up a second buyout window that opens 3 days after the hearing and lasts for 2 days. And according to Puckpedia, the only players with cap hits greater than $4 million and on their roster at the previous trade deadline are eligible to be brought out. So this gives some insight into how this all works. It gets a bit confusing with arbitration, but that means the ones that fit the description are the core five, and it's hard to envision any of them being bought out by the Leafs. so won't be as useful as it was last summer. So yeah, the second buyout window will be opened up, though for the Toronto Maple Leafs, I don't know if they're actually going to use that to make any significant changes. And the biggest thing here, again, last season he made $800,000. You could easily justify that. You could even probably justify $1 million AAV for Connor Dewar. He's good in the PK, does some little things. But 1.5 is where it gets a bit tricky. And obviously, it's a rough go. But Darius, what do you at least like out of Connor Dewar's game that we can, not to hate on him the whole time, that would maybe justify 1.5 million? Again, it's the fact that the other moves they made, and even some of the big free agent signings that we agreed with at the time and still do, in Chris Tanev and OEL, they still weren't necessarily cheap deals. They were still paying a premium price to get OEL, to get Chris Tanev. Even Yanni Hakanpää was the one who probably was the biggest discount. But I'd take Yanni Hakanpää over Connor Dewar most every day of the week at the price that they're paying, specifically given the Leafs' needs. And maybe that deal's fallen through. It hasn't been official yet, but I don't know. What do you like out of Connor Dewar's game to play devil's advocate?
Yeah, I want to be fair to the player too, because I really like the player. I just don't know if the salary cap hit makes sense for the Leafs. That's all I'm saying. But in terms of the player, he's still very young, right? And when he was brought over from Minnesota, I thought he injected something into the lineup that they were missing, because when he came over and he was playing in that fourth line position, especially in the playoffs, I feel like that line finally had purpose. Like, you knew exactly what they were out there to do. And I mean, this guy hits, he's quick, he's good on the penalty kill, right? Like, the penalty kill at the end of the season wasn't great, but I thought he was pretty good on the penalty kill, and he plays his role well, right? Like, he's not out of character ever. Like, he does exactly what you expect from him, which is that fourth line role, get in there, grind it out, skates, north south, which is exactly what Craig Berube wants from his players. So I think he would fit in the system really well again. But like I mentioned, like, I like how he gave that fourth line purpose, right? I'm not saying it was just him. It was a mix of everyone, of course, but his skills brought to that line really amplified them in the playoffs. So I like the player. I do. And it makes sense at league min, or maybe a little bit more. But when you're talking about $1.5 million, I just don't know if it makes sense for the Leafs. So they can bring this player back, absolutely, but they're going to have to make changes elsewhere in the lineup, or they get rid of the player. So it's going to be interesting to see how this works out in the next couple of weeks.
And again, to be clear, it's the 1.4 million is projected. It's not necessarily, that's not what they're offering,
right,
or what he's asking for. It's what the projection is. And it's possible, you can see here in the last sentence, it is certainly possible if the actual number comes down lower than that, but it is far from a guarantee. Maybe it's somewhere in the middle at 1.1 to 1.2, which make it a bit more easier, make the pill a bit easier to swallow for Leafs fans. But I don't know, very interesting, a very big decision for the Toronto Maple Leafs to make. So the point they are in the cap, each little $100,000, each little bit of money matters for the Toronto Maple Leafs. So it'll be very interesting to see. Let us know in the comments, what is the max amount of money you'd want to pay Connor Dewar, and we'll see you guys tomorrow.